Yeah, I was watching one.
Time to start.
Oh, there we go. Yep.
Now, people who tune in will actually be able to hear us talk.
Talking now?
Yes, yeah, because our audio is going out over the live stream, but
okay.
What they'll see, actually, I haven't checked for sure. They may even see the two little windows of us. In fact, I'm not even sure they see the timer. Except there's a delay, so.
I see 41 watching now. Yeah, I see, I'm looking at it now and I see your image.
You see, yeah, well, that means that they're not watching the timer, and I don't know why.
No, I see the timer. Oh, no, it's partially hidden by your image.
It is, huh?
Yeah, there's about a 15-second delay.
So something's wrong, because the timer should be the main thing on the screen. I'm sharing my, if you look at your Zoom screen, you mostly see the timer, I presume.
Yep.
And that's what should be going out over the live stream, is the timer, not the pictures of me. But for people who are tuning in now, we'll be starting in 8 minutes. So please be patient. And if you're watching the archive video, I'm sorry you're not seeing the archive, the time, the countdown timer. I don't know why it's not working. But we are live, and my screen is showing 96 people already. And if you're watching seeing the archive, the countdown timer, I don't know why it's. You know what I could do? No, I better not end the live stream. That'll mess everything up.
Yeah.
I tried that once before, and then I realized you can't get back in.
Yeah, no, don't mess with it.
But I'm very sorry the countdown timer isn't working.
Yeah, well, it is working. It's just that it's covered up a little bit by a little image of us on the upper right-hand side of the screen. If there's a way to move where that little image is, like to the lower right or lower left, and it wouldn't cover the countdown.
Oh. Well, let's see. Here. Now I have a little image on my screen. Is that making any difference?
Yeah, so I'm not looking at Facebook anymore because it was interacting with this. But
right. You don't want to create feedback.
Yeah.
So well, ideally, what people would be seeing now is mostly the countdown screen, but
well, can you tell by the comments in the stream?
Let's see.
Let's see if this will work. There. Oh, yeah. The filters work.
Oh.
Yeah, you can put on sunglasses. I like this one, the Zorro mask.
Uh-huh. Very, is that Zoom? You're using the Zoom?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Hey, do you want to know how we built a $50 million coaching company with just 140?
Okay, I am seeing the countdown window. Very, oh, is that Zoom? You're using the Zoom?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I see, it's just, the picture is just up in the corner, right where the countdown is.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so it's not as bad as I had thought. And I guess there's nothing I can do about that at the moment, but I can try and maybe next time I should move the actual numbers to a lower part of the screen.
If you can put the countdown timer to the bottom right,
Yeah,
that would be perfect.
right. Next time I'll know to do that.
Okay.
But at least people understand we're counting down. That's important.
Yep.
Well, thanks for being patient with me, Dean.
Sure. The technology is amazing already,
Yeah.
even for what it does. So it's all astonishing.
Okay. Okay, 3 minutes to go.
Was that my bing bong or yours?
That's a good question. I heard it not loud and clear, but I don't know where it came from.
Yeah, I don't think I did that.
Okay, somebody is trying to. People are sending their email questions to me, which I don't want to have to field email. So that was for Colin Richardson. Post your question in the chat. We're going to be starting in 1 minute.
Yeah, I don't have any incoming email, at least not about this.
Yeah, I should turn my email program off because I don't want to take emails.
Yeah.
In fact, I try to turn, and what I should do is turn almost any other program off so there's no other interference.
Yeah, everything on mine is turned off, I think.
Okay. Okay. And we're going to be going live in 20 seconds. 10 seconds. There. And we're live now with Dean Radin. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you once again. Dean is in Boise, Idaho, and he is the chief scientist of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He is the author of a number of books, including most recently Real Magic, as well as Supernormal, Entangled Minds, and The Conscious Universe. So lots of questions are coming in already. Dean, would you like to say anything by way of introduction before I begin fielding questions?
I could say that the Institute of Noetic Sciences is located in Petaluma, California. That's where our retreat center is. But because of COVID, some of us are still there. Some of us are scattered in many other places now because we're all working remotely. And we hope at some point to have the retreat center open again, which is where our laboratories are. So we haven't been doing laboratory studies in the interim either. That doesn't mean that we're not active. We're writing papers or catching up with previous work. There's still a lot that's being done.
Well, and I should mention, this is a rare opportunity for our viewers to be able to pose questions with you live. You've indicated to me that because of your current work schedule, you'll be doing very few video interviews or live streams for the next 6 months.
Right.
So we're pleased and honored to be with you today, Dean. Here's a question from Brian Rice, a very interesting question, who asks, hello, Dean. Other than your corporate park synchronicity experience with the Psi researcher next door, what was your most profound moment of observation or experience regarding Psi?
I would say that it was when I got the briefing on the Stargate program, which wasn't called that back then, but I got the briefing on the classified program from Hal Puthoff when I joined that program. Because up until then, I had read the literature, of course, and had heard stories about what people could do, but I really didn't understand that at very high levels of talent, that remote viewers can do things that are pragmatically useful. And that's the first time I had seen that kind of information, like one operation mission after the other. And that was pleasing and shocking at the same time.
Remote viewing. So did they take you through the process yourself?
Yeah, but that wasn't part of the briefing. The briefing was the same thing that a congressperson or military person would get, to bring them up to speed very quickly on what the program was like, and then lots of examples of where the remote viewers gave useful information.
Okay, here's another question from Ricardo, who says, what are the most practical applications regarding Psi research that you can think about?
Probably the number one is healing. We don't normally think of Psi as part of healing, but in the general domain of energy medicine or subtle energies or words like that, there are an awful lot of people out there who are making their living as healers, one form or another, and a lot of people gain benefit from it. So that's probably the number one application. Number two might be dowsing, either field dowsing, which may or may not involve Psi, I think it probably does, or map dowsing. Both of those are viable professions. What that question usually is asking about what kind of technological gizmo is there out there that is like a psychotronic machine. And there, I don't know of any that are used other than for entertainment at this point. There are some machines that claim diagnosis capability, but I haven't seen any carefully controlled studies to prove that the diagnoses that they come up with are actually real, or at least legitimate. So we have a whole program at IONS that we call IONS X, the X project, which is looking at the various applications and trying to create a technological one. And it's really, really difficult, and we know that. And the reason why we're doing it is because when you're faced with the equivalent of going to the moon and you don't know how you're going to do that yet, in the process, you're forced to learn a lot very quickly. And so we're taking this moonshot approach to take everything that we know about the way the psi works and make it into a kind of a technology.
Here's a question from Joe Bananas 37. Hi there, he says. Is Dean concerned about any indirect influence he may have on experimental results from his own intentions, like a kind of a law of attraction influence on your research?
Well, yes and no. So the yes, well, if I'll start with the no. The no is that if we do an experiment that involves a number of participants, and I am not the one who is running the participants in the experiment, then I'm less concerned that I am directly influencing the result. Because of that, I'm maintaining as much distance as I possibly can from the active experiment. On the other hand, the yes part is that it's not possible to extract an experimenter from the experiment, especially when dealing with psi. So yes, I am concerned not only about a real-time active influence, like my wishes somehow getting mixed into the experiment, but even more so that my wish for a positive outcome might even act in a retrocausal way. And then things get very tricky very quickly. And so we know that retrocausal influences look like they're possible because of experiments like random number generator experiments where the data are recorded but not looked at yet. And then sometime in the future, instructions are given to influence the data backwards in time. And I'll put the word influence in quotes because I don't think it's actually influencing it backwards. But nevertheless, that would be a way of describing what is happening in a temporal direction, that your future influences the past in some way. And so we know that that works, in which case any experiment can be influenced by the person in the future who is looking at the results. And is that a problem? You bet it is. It's a gigantic epistemological puzzle, which is both disturbing because of its implications, but also an incredibly interesting challenge to try to figure out if psi actually transcends space and time, which seems to be its main characteristic, then virtually all of the methods that are used in science to study anything have a confound. They have a flaw. So again, frustrating and fantastic at the same time.
Here's a question from Julie Tasker, who is one of our volunteers. And she says, what tips can you provide for opening up to paranormal phenomena?
Turn on the TV or look at YouTube. You'll open up more paranormal stuff than you cared to think about. But more seriously, I'm often asked, well, how can I become more psychic? And my first response to that is, you're really sure you want to do that? Really? I mean, think about this. If you're able to open your mind to the universe at large, you had also better learn how to shut it back down. Because the most common complaint that I hear from people is that they're open to everything and it's driving them crazy. Like they lose the sense of self. They can't tell the difference between their own thoughts and other people's thoughts, and are they being influenced by other people and all of that stuff. It leads you down the rabbit hole really quickly. So I would say then that the safest and time-honored way is to meditate. And within the process of calming down physically and calming down mentally, you learn to engage more and more subtle perceptions. But as part of that training, you also need to learn how to turn it off. In many ways, I think evolution has pushed us in the direction, so your ordinary state of awareness is to turn it off. Because otherwise, we don't really need to know what's happening on Pluto right now. And if you're fully open to the universe, you're just going to be overwhelmed.
Here's a very interesting question from First Araz, who says, can you name for the audience the most important or profound published papers in parapsychology for people who want to look at the technical literature? Where should they start?
Well, for a number of years, I had a list of such papers. Most of them are a couple of years old, so the PDFs are available. They were on the IONS website for a while. I don't know exactly where I would go now, but what I'm doing is I'm in the process now of reviewing those papers, and we'll put them back onto a place on the IONS website where all of them would be available. So we're talking about probably 50 articles, which are a couple of years past publication, so that we can provide the PDFs without violating the journal embargoes. So in the meantime, academia.org and ResearchGate and so on, those are always pretty good places to get papers, oftentimes for free from the original authors. And barring that, I would say then a secondary place to look are my books, because I have hundreds of references in there and many of them point to the original article. So once you have a title of something, you can go online, type the title, and you're very likely to find it.
Modern Monastery says, have you ever pursued or would you consider to study some of the supposedly super talented individuals like Ted Owens, the PK Man, or like Uri Geller?
We get contacted by people who claim those kinds of talents all the time, typically saying, you need to study me because, and fill in the blank. I have on occasion done that. IONS in general tends not to do that because people underestimate the amount of resources necessary to study individuals. I mean, now it's particularly difficult because of COVID, but even when we were open and the laboratory was running, we would have to match the person's claims to a controlled test. And that is not so easy. So we do work with talented people when we have an experiment that requires talent. So for example, we've been doing studies on mediumship, and we then go out and recruit professional mediums. And similar for other kinds of talents. We go looking for certain kinds of people. It's unusual, though, to find somebody like Ted Owens is a great example. The book you wrote really captures the nature of that person, who is not so easy to work with, right? It's somebody with a...
To put it mildly.
Yeah. So somebody with a specialized talent may not be able to do what is available in classic psi tests. And so you can be convinced after a while that something weird is happening, but how do you capture it in a way that's going to be able to verify what's going on? Sometimes they don't want to sit still for an experiment, or they don't like your experiment, or there's all kinds of reasons that can get in the way of doing an experiment. Probably the number one is the demand characteristic of it, right? We want you to do this experiment, sit down here, do this in this way right now. And then very often they can't, because they'll say, well, this is not what I do. Okay, well, if we had 6 months or 9 months and enough resources to devise a specialized experiment, maybe we could capture something. It's not so easy.
Here's a fascinating question from Domi. And Domi asks, is there a possibility that the placebo effect can have detrimental consequences on patients of materialistic, allopathic physicians? In other words, can it create disease as well as cure or heal them?
Yeah, it's called the Nocebo Effect. It's the opposite of placebo. And the nocebo apparently works just as well as the placebo. So yeah, if you go to a doctor and the doctor starts telling you all of the horrible things that's wrong with you, will that push you in a negative direction? Yeah, it will. Right? You know, our physiology and our belief are tightly coupled. And so you can improve or suppress the immune system based on what you say, what you believe.
And here, Ricardo asks, can you give your opinion regarding macro psychokinesis or telekinesis?
I was very skeptical about any form of mind-matter interaction that would be visible without statistics. And of course, I had heard for years about people bending spoons and bending metal rods and things of that sort. And I didn't quite know what to make of that, even though the people telling me these things, I didn't think they were lying about it, but I thought, well, maybe they didn't know their own strength. Until one time I went to a so-called PK party where spoons were being bent, and I was given a large silver-plated soup spoon, which would be my target. And I had no semblance that I would be able to do it, but I was kind of going along with the game, and I was watching other people, and I wanted to see it happen. And then I bent it. I bent the bowl in half. So because I wasn't in an altered state, as far as I can tell, because I immediately looked at my fingers to see was I using force and not realizing it? Was I dissociated in some way? And the answer was no. I was very well aware of what was happening. And so I bent it about a quarter of the way. Somebody brought that to my attention. And they said, okay, well, keep bending it. So I did. I bent it all the way over. And it felt very much like I've heard people describe. It was like soft taffy for a moment. So I bent it all the way over. It hardened up. It was cold throughout. I checked the temperature. And it's a big spoon. So afterwards, I got the same spoon from the same manufacturer and measured how much torque you actually need to do that. And it's way beyond what I could do by physical force. Well, I think what anybody could do, because when you have the shell shape of the spoon is stamped there, is really tough. And then the thing about, well, maybe it got warm because you were holding it and you're rubbing it a little bit. I've used spoons forever in boiling water and stuff, and they don't flop over like that. So that experience, and this is actually an interesting case, because up to that point, I didn't know that this was really possible. After that point, I figured, okay, I don't know how to explain this, but it is possible. That then, even for me, who's experienced and seen a lot of interesting psychic things, that made me more sympathetic to the idea that even larger effects, poltergeist activity and so on, it made it more real that sort of thing could happen. It's far more challenging from an experimental point of view, because even the PK parties, most of it is, almost all of it really is spontaneous. I've afterwards tried to get back into that mental state where I bent a spoon. I've never been able to do it again. And part of it is because my own fear. I've recognized that if I can bend the metal of a spoon. I remember flying home after this party that I was at on the airplane, and I was on the airplane and I was trying to bend the spoon until I suddenly had this shock of realization that if I bent the spoon, maybe I'd bend the wings of the airplane, because I had no idea what was happening or how I did it. And so that put enough of the fear in me to not do it, at least on an airplane, but even further than that, to maybe not do it in general, because I didn't know what I was going to unleash, and I don't want the wings of the airplane to fall off accidentally. So I completely understand how these kinds of phenomena are fearful, because we don't have very tight control over it. And this is not so much with perceptual side, but with psychokinetic effects, macro effects. It's kind of scary.
Ethan Margalith asks, what persuaded you at the inception of your career to give credibility to these areas of research in the face of such social skepticism?
I guess it was after reading about the experiments and trying them and seeing that there were interesting effects. I had the opportunity, as a part of a business trip, this was way back when I was at Bell Labs, to go to San Antonio for a conference. And I took off from the conference and visited Helmut Schmidt and William Broad, who were working at a lab in San Antonio at the time. So I think that was the first time that I was able to visit an active lab with people who knew what they were doing. And since I was working at Bell Labs at the time, I was very well aware of what big science is like. Lots of smart people, lots of equipment, all of that in the labs at the time. I was able to compare then, well, are these people delusional? Are they using technology correctly? Can I believe the results? And I didn't see any red flags at all. In fact, what I was seeing was essentially a confirmation of what I had been learning through running my own experiments. And I would say it took about 5 years of doing experiments and paying much closer attention to the people who were doing these kinds of studies, including the folks at Princeton, because after I got my doctorate, I interviewed for the job at the Paralab, or actually in Princeton itself, and would have been working with the Paralab, and got firsthand knowledge of, again, a comparison between what I knew to be top flight research and science. I saw the same thing going on there. And a few years later, I saw it again at SRI International. So it was this repeated exposure to scientists who knew that they were doing what they were doing in the most rigorous way that you can imagine, that gave me more and more confidence that, first of all, you can apply science to these things and you can get interesting results. So it's accumulation over 5 or 6 years where I finally decided that if it were possible to have a career as a scientist to do this sort of research, yeah, there's all kinds of pushback. But on the other hand, if you have the opportunity to do it, there's nothing more interesting. So I've been fortunate to find ways of doing this as part of my career.
Ricardo asks, is levitation real?
I would say we don't know. There are the stories, there's pictures on YouTube, which who knows what's happening when you see something on YouTube. I would say my openness to the possibility is a little bit higher after I bent a bowl of a spoon in half. One time I went to the Maharishi International University and watched the best yogic flyers in the world do their thing. This was like a special presentation to visiting scientists and scholars who were brought into a room, and then they had the brought in 4 of the top yogic flyers. And what we saw was that they were hopping. Now they're hopping in a peculiar way that an average person couldn't do because you get exhausted in two minutes. In full lotus, they were hopping around. If that's the best that we can do, well, then I didn't see any. In fact, I asked afterwards, I said, well, they don't appear to be flying. In fact, they don't even appear to be hovering. This is ballistic hopping. So why is this yogic flying? Well, the answer was, well, they're hopping around really good, like jumping 3 feet up and so on, but they're doing it for 5 or 10 minutes, and that's exhausting if you're doing it purely by force. And they did not appear to be all that tired. So on the other hand, if they're Olympic athletes and they're doing that, well, maybe their musculature is able to do it. So I don't know what to make of that, except that I don't know at this point. I don't have high confidence that anybody can do it. I'm certainly willing to watch if somebody can.
Here's a question from Kirill Shirikov, who asks, do you know of similar research to the work you're doing conducted in Europe and China, India, or Russia? Do you communicate or collaborate with researchers in other countries?
Oh yeah, all the time. So not so much in Russia, although I know some people there. And again, even in China, but I know some people there too. But our online networks, email lists and so on are at this point mostly in countries other than the United States. Probably the center is Europe, but with people around the world, every continent, we have colleagues. And so while we might not be working directly in terms of an ongoing study or experiment, we are communicating with each other all the time.
Here's a question from Terry Olison, who is asking about chakras. Said the human species has generated many religious and philosophical investigations, but what has parapsychology discovered about the chakras? And why is it so hard to find actual studies on this?
I don't know anybody in parapsychology who's studying the chakras. It's partially because the chakras are considered subtle energies. Some people can feel them, some people can see effects. I've had experiences myself that were very odd, but all of our conventional instruments don't pick it up. You could have magnetic field meters and electric meters and all kinds of the usual things you'd find in a physics or an engineering lab to try to pick up the internal feelings of energy associated, I put energy in quotes, associated with the chakras, and we don't pick up anything. That makes it really, really difficult to study, because if we don't have an instrument to study it, all that's left is subjective impressions. So there's an enormous amount of lore associated with chakras. And as I said, one time during a bodywork session, I felt the solar plexus chakra in terms of, I mean, what I felt was something like a vortex. Something was moving like a vortex. It was funneling in and out of my solar plexus with an enormous amount of what I would call felt energy. That it like a magnetic field or something, a rotating magnetic field, right where that chakra is supposedly supposed to be. I had the presence of mind at the time to think that if I had a magnetometer, I was sure it would pick up something, because it really, really felt strong. In retrospect, I suspect it would have picked up nothing, because in energy medicine, when people talk about energy, it's a felt sense, which is very different than the four forces known to physics. And this is why it has been so difficult to figure out how are we going to objectively measure that? We don't know. So we finished this 6-month study of healers, 17 energy medicine healers. And one of the measures that we were looking at was not energy, but information. Because I kind of suspect now, and you see this at the leading edge of physics anyway, that you can describe the world in informational terms. And it could be then that what people are talking about, subtle energies and the chakras energies and even colors and everything associated with it, is more of an informational or symbolic thing that you can get subjectively, but otherwise would be very difficult to measure in any objective sense unless you use an informational measure. So we're coming up with ideas of how would you detect a change in information associated with something to do with the human body. Well, we have devices that do that. They're called random number generators. They detect changes in entropy, essentially. So we're working now on a new kind of measure, an instrument that we think might be able to visualize changes in information or entropy around the human body. And then we'll see, well, maybe this is not measuring energy, it's measuring gradients of entropy, essentially. Maybe we'd be able to pick it up, and then we can use that as a way of visualizing maybe what people report when they get it subjectively.
So I recall from our recent interview in your study of energy medicine, you had a special device, as I recall, it contained 16 random event generators all in one device, and you were comparing the outputs of them in different ways.
Yeah, and we saw significant deviations while the healing was taking place and not when no healing was taking place. And others have found the similar effects. So it suggests that we can get an objective measure, which is not energetic, that is correlated with healing action. And so we are in the midst of expanding that kind of idea into an instrument that might actually be able to detect and visualize what's happening here.
Here's a question from Daiwan. What is the current state of the art in characterizing and understanding the Trickster effect?
Well, of course, it depends entirely on what is meant by the Trickster. The Trickster, at least from its mythological nature in these experiments, is that the harder you try to get something, the more it will hide that effect and show up in some other way. So you oftentimes in a psi experiment will end up with anomalies, but not always the ones that you want to get. So the trickster then is something that seems to get in the way of your surface level intention. And so I wrote a paper on this a couple of years ago called Tricking the Trickster. And the idea of it was that when you look at a very simple thing like a card test or other forced choice tests, that one of the things that happens when you're asked to repeatedly guess a playing card or equivalent is that your mind gets in the way because you start thinking, well, I just said that card, so it's probably not going to be that again. And the statistical counter gets in the way. And it makes it very difficult for every trial to become independent of the previous trials. So I figured, okay, well, that's kind of a psychological trickster that gets in the way, but maybe there are other things going on. So there's this group of Christian scientists who were testing their own faith, essentially, called spindrift. And they came up with a curious kind of effect that was a kind of trickster phenomenon that was causing the calls in a forced choice test to be manipulated in a very strange way. So they wrote all about this, and then they said it's a way of scrambling the results. So it looks like you get nothing, but actually there's a structure underneath it. So years ago, I did an analysis of a test that they had used to develop this, and I got very similar results. And it's a strange kind of mixing of the calls, the calls that a user would make or a subject and the random targets. So because I have this online test, a card test and other kinds of simple psi tests that's been online since 2000, when I put it, we have 2 decades, tens of millions of trials in a forced choice card test. So I applied that method to all of these calls, tens of millions of calls, and found a very small effect, but because we had so much data, statistically, it was completely off the charts in the direction. And this was very interesting because it showed a structure, an extremely subtle structure that nobody would have guessed in advance because it seems crazy. But I predicted then that if that is a real thing, it should show up in these tests in the same way that we see it in simpler tests, like a binary task. Well, these are five card tasks. And I found it. So I applied it to another forced choice test, again from the gotpsi.org data, again with tens of millions of guesses by lots of people. We found it again. So combined, I don't remember the exact statistics, but it's basically a gazillion to 1 odds against chance of finding that particular pattern in the data. So I called it, the title of the paper was Tricking the Trickster, because in a sense, by getting a clue about how something might begin to obscure results when there really is something going on, you can begin to outguess what the trickster was doing and actually see results that are quite interesting. So the trickster might be portions of the human mind that would rather not see psi. It could be that our own internal concerns or fears about these things get in the way, or it could be something much stranger than that. It could be that there is some kind of an inherent uncertainty in these kinds of phenomena that can also get in the way. And if you're clever enough to figure out how to stop it or how to get around it, well, then you could end up with very interesting results. So just to give one other example, when you do an experiment involving a random number generator, the usual way of thinking about what's happening is you see a squiggly line and you want to push it mentally so that you get more ones and zeros. That's the way the Pear Lab had done it. You can say, okay, well, the data overall shows that people can do that to a very small extent, but the probabilities are kind of go in that direction. But what if you come along with somebody who is kind of a little bit concerned subconsciously that they don't want this to happen because it's scary? Well, the intention can flip, because now they have this internal conflict that say, yeah, I really want to see it. And then you start seeing it and say, ew, I'm making something happen in the world. It's scary. And it flips and goes into reverse. So if you use what's called a mean shift test, like more ones or more zeros, it's going to balance out. You're going to end up with nothing. If you use a variance measure, which is simply how deviant are you, positive and negative, you can then recapture that something unusual happened. And so we've seen this many times now in different kinds of experiments where variance effects show up, but mean shifts do not. So that's, in a way, another way, of a simple way, very simple way of looking at trickster-like effects and recovering the signal out of it.
Is that paper, Tricking the Trickster, is that publicly available?
I believe it is. If you look up that, you'll probably end up on my personal website where I think I have a link to it. Yeah.
Very good. Adriana Wallace asks you, have you had any personal experiences in the area of spiritual mediumship or spirit communication?
Only in the context of experiments. So we've done experiments with perhaps 24 mediums now in various designs. The only personal experiences that I've had with mediums is that it actually, in both cases, they were going to do a reading, like just a demonstration. They came up with interesting information, but I would say that nothing that I found particularly impressive. So not exactly platitudes, but nothing that I would say, well, this is evidence that there's no way in the world they could have known that. And even in the experiments that we've done with professional mediums, it's very clear that they get verifiable information about the clients, but from a statistical perspective. So we can check if you give 10 or 15 responses about a departed loved one, and it turns out that statistically they're right, well, that's impressive. I mean, they're getting information from somewhere. But it means also that a fair amount of the time, the information that's being obtained is not precise enough to know what to do with it. So I do have I've set up a time for a reading with a professional medium. This will be the first time I actually will do that as a personal thing, but that's coming up in February. So I don't have any stories about it yet.
Here's a question from Wazwan Ulhak, who says, Salam from England.
Oh.
If it is information and not energy, as you were describing earlier in your answer to the question about chakras, what is the nature of this information?
That's not so easy to answer, because depending on your definition of information, some people would say that it is patterns in energy. So it involves energy, but it's the pattern in the energy that makes a difference. So the metaphor or the analogy I like to use is somebody whispers something in your ears. And the whisper is very, very gentle, and it's a very small amount of energy. But depending on what the whisper content is, it's the meaning of the whisper, which is about information. If I whispered in your ear, you just won the $500 million lottery. It's very, very soft to say that. You would have this massive physiological reaction. And there are many other examples like that you can use. So it's a very tiny trickle of information. It's just sonic movements, but you interpret it and it creates this gigantic effect. So in that case, it is a pattern impressed into an aspect of the physical world. In that case, it has to be, it's sonic, but you could think of it in many other ways, electronic and so on. So the other way then is thinking of this as a little bit more in a symbolic manner. So in quantum mechanics, for example, as John Wheeler and others have said, it's all about it from bit. What he meant by that phrase is that itness, meaning objects in the real world, actually emerge out of information. That's the bit. So the it from bit is you can give a description of reality and actually mathematically see how that description will give rise to the physical world at large. Of course, the quantum type information is not exactly patterned energy. It's prior to that. It's more in the realm of what Bohm would have called an implicate order, or the wave function, whatever that happens to be, but it's not exactly physical. It's more in a symbolic sense. So this is one of the reasons why I wrote Real Magic, there's the book back there, was because a lot of concepts underneath magic have to do with symbolic manipulation of reality. And it's like it's this close to what people talk about in terms of quantum information. And it was that's what struck me in thinking about there's something is being talked about from two completely different directions, but both kind of going in the same direction, that there's a way of manipulating information or symbols that is directly related to our experience of the physical world.
And I've got a question here from Kavan Ganapathy, who asks, what is your best method to reproduce precognition in an experiment?
Well, I think probably the presentiment experiment. So this is the pre-feeling experiment, not the kind of Daryl Bem did, but the ones that use physiology. And the reason is that anytime you do an experiment where you ask somebody to do something consciously, you immediately run into all kinds of psychological filters that prevent it from happening. So doing a purely physiological experiment is much easier, both on the subject and anybody else involved, because you're relying on the person's unconscious response. So they don't get a chance to consciously deflect it. So that's why I came up with this idea of an experiment where you're about to see a picture or some kind of stimulus that could be calm or emotional. And we're just looking at how your heart rate changes beforehand, or how your skin conductance changes. And that seems to, for me, certainly, it worked really well. It's also valuable in the sense that while I do worry about the experimenter effect, like a psychic experimenter just knows what to do, the raw data in this case is somebody else's physiology. So unless I am both really good at precognition and know what's going to come up and am able to influence somebody else's physiology, well, then it looks like the data is actually coming from those subjects and not from me. And so I did maybe 4 or 5 experiments, and then colleagues started to replicate it. And the last I heard is around 40 such replications. And the results are very clear that this is an independently repeatable effect. And from an effect size point of view, it's pretty robust. It's at least as good as the best remote viewing that we see. So
we're talking about a remote stimulus that is influencing people's physiology before the stimulus arrives.
Yes, not only before it arrives, but before it is decided upon by a random number generator after you've made your decision, after you've started the trial. And there are other designs, of course, but the point of it is that nobody knows, including the experimenter, what's about to happen. So we look at the physiology before that to see if you differentially respond appropriately for what the future stimulus is going to be.
In effect, it's like you could say people sometimes feel the hair on the back of their neck right before something happens.
Yeah, and this was based actually on an episode. I've been thinking about this even when I was at Edinburgh at the time, the university there. But what really cemented it was talking to a colleague of mine when I was at the University of Novato. So this colleague would go hunting with his buddies, and they brought a bunch of guns, of course, and he had among the other guns, a 6-shot double action revolver. So this is the kind of gun where you pull the trigger and the cylinder turns, and then the hammer hits the next bullet in line. And it all happens in one smooth way. So you can just keep pulling the trigger. So for safety's sake, he would leave the 6th chamber empty, because the hammer is like sitting over that, so it couldn't be jostled and accidentally go off. But if you pull the hammer, it's going to go to the fifth chamber and it would hit that and would go off. So he, in preparation for going to the hunting trip, he took the whole gun apart, he's cleaning everything, and now he's putting the bullets back in place. 1, 2, 3, 4. And when he picked up the fifth bullet, he had a really bad feeling. So he said he put the bullet aside. He didn't know why, but he just set it aside and then put the hammer over the sixth chamber like he usually does and just said, okay, that's finished. 2 weeks go by, he goes out with his buddies, they go hunting all day, they come back, and then they started drinking, which people do. And that's not a good idea if you have lots of guns around, because 2 of his friends got into a fight. One of them picked up his gun, his revolver, pointed it directly at the face of this other guy. And of course, he was horrified and stepped in between them to stop this potential disaster. But it was too late because the other guy was already pulling the trigger, the cylinder turned, and instead of going bang, shooting him directly in the face, it went click into the fifth chamber. So the reason why this is the kind of experiment I want to do. It's like a Russian roulette experiment. Is it going to go off or not? Well, you can't put people in real danger in an experiment, but that is the kind of experience where he realized at that time that if he had not had the bad feeling about that bullet, he would be dead. So I said, okay, let's figure out a way to simulate this kind of effect. And that's what led to this experimental design, which turns out to be really effective without putting people in danger.
That's a fascinating story. And that line of research, what's it called if somebody wanted to look it up?
I call it presentiment.
Presentiment.
Right. So as contrast with precognition, precognition means pre-knowing, presentiment means pre-feeling. Because when he picked up the bullet, he didn't know what was going to happen. He just had a bad feeling. And it's usually the bad feeling, which is what we're capturing in these experiments.
And it's considered one of the strong research paradigms in parapsychology, as you mentioned, some 40 replications already.
Yeah. So it's a little bit more difficult in some other studies because you need to know something about physiology and have a way to measure it and a way to analyze it. But if you do have the equipment and know what you're doing, it's not difficult to do. In fact, 2 colleagues, both Dick Bierman in the Netherlands and Julia Mossbridge in California, they said, well, this design of the experiment, this is done like thousands of times. This is no different than standard psychophysiology, which is the science of studying how we respond, how our mental and physical systems are interacting. So they both got the idea at different times to look in the literature for a similar experiment where the data were available to see if even in already published experiments that were done for different reasons, conventional reasons, would you still see a presentiment result if you look backwards in time from the moment of the stimulus, which is normally not done. And they both found evidence that the answer is yes, which is really good because it now means that the experiment I was using is based on basic psychophysiology, except we just did it slightly differently and looked backwards in time. Well, you could do that with raw data from other experiments and you still see the effect. And that means that these kinds of unconscious precognitions are going on all the time, even showing up in academic studies that were done for other reasons. And of course, in the real world, they show up all the time too, which is what people generally will call something like a gut feeling or a hunch.
What an excellent description. Thank you for that, Dean. I have a question here from Russell Targ, who was one of our colleagues. In fact, Russell is going to be the guest on our live stream 2 weeks from today on January 31st. Russell is one of the pioneer researchers in remote viewing, also one of the pioneer researchers using random event generators for ESP tests.
Yeah.
And Russell asks, Dean, do you still find that meditators are significantly more successful in PK tasks than non-meditators?
Well, I would say yes, but not because they have magic abilities, but because they're able to do the task. So the task, usually in any kind of psychokinetic task, involves high attention, focused attention, and focused intention. And so if you have an attentional task and you're asking somebody who's never meditated to do it before, we know because we've done EEG while they're doing the tasks that they focus, their intention is there, and about 5 seconds later it's gone. That they say, well, do this, think this way in this abstract system out there and make it do this. And after 5 seconds, they're dreaming about cheeseburgers because mind wandering is happening all the time. And unless you're an experienced meditator, the mind wandering will just overwhelm the task. And so you get a weak, quote, signal out of that. So the meditators simply have more attention training and in that sense are able to do the task better. So yeah, we tend to get slightly better results. Not whoppingly better, but slightly better.
And here's a question from Laura Newbert, who is one of our volunteers. Laura asked, do you prioritize your research projects according to your own personal interests or as it would benefit the cumulative research effort in the field?
That's a very good question. I usually tend to do what I want to do. I'm not always able to do that though, because you need funding to do it. So it's a balancing act between writing a grant proposal or convincing donors that this is something you think is important. So you have to sell the idea, or you have to be lucky enough to get a grant. But I always have some room left aside to pursue things that I'm interested in. Because I do find, and I'm sure other experimentalists find this too, that the ability to get a good result in any kind of experiment, but more so in a psi experiment, is a degree of motivation and interest and enthusiasm that you could bring to the task. And so if you're doing something kind of rote, which is one of the reasons I don't actually like doing replications at all, whether it's my own studies or other people's studies, because that initial enthusiasm and motivation is reduced. And I've seen again and again that the first time you do something, there's the first timers effect, where you're just fascinated to find out what's going to happen. The results are much, much better. And it's really difficult to recapture that. So I find if I'm highly motivated to study something and see what's going to happen, the results are way better. So if I'm lucky, I have funding to do that. And it doesn't, like, I don't need a huge amount of money to get equipment or something. And even when we do have funding, to do the same experiment over and over again is, in a sense, you have to do that, because otherwise you can't even believe it yourself. Oftentimes you get a really good result in an experiment. You're saying, really? That's really real like that? So you have to do it a couple more times, or maybe more so, convince yourself that it's a real thing, and then convince your colleagues to try it too, because you really never believe anything until somebody else can see it. So it's a combination. Sometimes we're funded to do something. More often I try to follow, as Joseph Campbell would have said, I follow my bliss.
Victor Romanovsky asks, do you think it's possible to reconcile discoveries in parapsychology with a materialistic worldview?
So there are two answers to that. First of all, our concept of material has radically changed over the 20th century and is continuing to radically change, mainly through quantum mechanics. Our notion of material is so far away from somebody in the beginning of the 20th century would have thought was material, that I can imagine, for example, and I recently wrote a paper on this, where if there are aspects of the brain that operate in a quantum fashion, then it shouldn't be surprising that there are non-local aspects to awareness. Because if the brain is giving rise to consciousness, which is the mainstream neuroscience approach. But the brain is operating in some aspects of it are non-local, not completely, but some of it. Well, then part of your awareness should be non-local. Well, what is that? Well, that's what we call psi. In addition, if it's operating in a quantum fashion, then observation makes a difference. That's what we call PK. So I can imagine that even based on the little that we know today about quantum mechanics and the little we know about quantum biology, that a quote materialistic explanation, or at least a mainstream type explanation, could emerge out of that kind of knowledge. So that's a possibility, I think, that we're heading in that direction. The other part of this answer, though, is that I've been kicked screaming constantly for years away from what might be thought of as 20th century materialism and much further into the direction of idealism, or at least neutral monism as a philosophy. And that's because at least from a classical physics perspective, none of this psychic stuff makes any sense at all. That's why there's so much resistance to it, especially from psychologists who basically remember Newtonian physics, but they don't know anything else. So the resistance largely comes from thinking of the brain as a classical object and then trying to figure out, well, how could a hunk of tissue in your head pick up what's going on in Jupiter? Well, it can't, and that's why it would be called impossible. The moment you step into a more modern version of what's going on in the physical world, well, then other possibilities arise. So I would say then that if we're able to imagine what 22nd century physics looks like, I expect it will go much, much further in the direction where, yes, it'll be materialistic, but material at that point will bear no resemblance to what we think of it as today. It'll be a lot closer to understanding how these things work. And I don't even know if they'll still call it material at that point. It's some weird quasi-informational, who knows what. But it'll be much, much closer to at least a scientific understanding of what's happening that would not require going into full-blown idealism, even though that might be true too.
Ricardo asks, many skeptics will argue that your studies and others, alike yours, have statistical problems, misinterpretation of the data, and other sorts of errors. What is your counter argument to this?
Well, in some cases, they may be right. No experiments are perfect. What I can say, though, is that the analysis of the designs and the statistics, especially for the well-known classes of experiments, they tend to be pretty simple. Like the Ganzfeld test is very simple counting statistics. They've been vetted over the years by many, many skeptics, finding every loophole you can imagine. And the loopholes are eventually closed and you still get the same results, or you get better results sometimes. So the argument, the same kinds of arguments, that there are flaws and fraud and all of these arguments, you can see this in every domain of science. This is not just what you see in Psi world. When there are people who are arguing against empirical data, they will see, because they're looking at it from a particular viewpoint, that there are problems with it. And then they'll come up with explanations like, well, there must be something wrong. Maybe the statistics are wrong. Maybe, lots of maybes. The proof in the pudding here is when there are independent replications, because any one experiment might be wrong. The independent replications and use of meta-analysis show that there is repeatability going on, which is the same level of repeatability that you see in standard psychology or social sciences. Well, what do? We either argue, as some are doing, that science itself is broken. Like our methods are just broken somehow, and we shouldn't believe anything. The fallacy with that kind of argument, though, is we think we believe in some things, and those things were developed using those same methods. So why would you believe in anything? There's some that will go that far too and say that everything we know is wrong or everything we know is flawed in some way. So there's a whole spectrum here where I would say the methods that we use in science are pretty good because they lead to technologies which The proof in the pudding there is we're able to do live streaming like this. So some of the science is pretty good, and the methods underneath it are also pretty good, but everything advances. So we learn from mistakes, and that's why constructive criticism is so valuable. It's the denier type criticisms which are not valuable at all.
We're at the top of the hour, and I just want to let everybody know we're going to continue for another half hour. So 30 more minutes to go. Here's a wonderful question from Archon Tour, who asks, who is your idol, or who are your heroes or role models, and why?
Well, I don't think I have just one. I would say that it's a series of mentors. When I was younger, probably in my 30s and maybe even 40s, the senior people in the field of parapsychology, maybe a dozen of them, having a chance to meet them, to visit their labs, sometimes to work in their labs, and then being able to compare those people against what I would say are more mainstream people, scientists and technologists in other fields, and not only seeing that they were about the same, but in most cases, actually, better is not the right word. It's like more open or more willing to take risks to advance the unknown. So I'm thinking of people like Helmut Schmidt, the pioneer who developed the random number generator. I mean, a truly exceptional intellect and ability to come up with interesting ideas, mathematical, experimental, and make things and do experiments. I mean, this, and again, as somebody already mentioned, this in the face of an enormous amount of pressure not to do this, but he did it anyway. So this gave me some internal sense that it's okay if you think you're onto something. And you hear this, if you read about the lives of people who make great inventions and breakthroughs and so on, they're driven internally. You get a sense that you really think this is important and you have to follow it. You almost don't even have a choice in the matter. You're driven by it. So I wouldn't say I'm not obsessive in the sense of being driven, but I can see the value of studying the nature of consciousness, because after all, that's really the only thing we ever know is our awareness. So I think it behooves everybody to understand the nature of that better. My internal sense has always been, as long as I can remember, that we are way more powerful in our minds than we are given credit for. And so that's why as a kid, I started reading everything I could find about this topic and related ones, because I felt that was true. So as a teenager, when I discovered that you could apply scientific methods to study this field, I thought, wow, if you could actually do that as a living, that would be holy smoke. That's the best thing possible. So I guess that's not exactly an answer, but that's the best as I can do.
Well, you mentioned Helmut Schmidt, who was truly a wonderful pioneer. I remember bringing him to the Berkeley campus and introducing him to a Nobel laureate scientist there who practically kicked us out of his office. But he was indeed a pioneer. Are there any other names that you'd like to mention?
Yeah. So.
Whoop. Sorry, I muted you by mistake. There we go.
No, it says I am muted.
No, you're unmuted. Oh, yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. So William Broad is another. So William Broad was one of the pioneers of the feeling of being stared at study, the so-called D-Mills design, direct mental interactions with living systems. And Helmut and William worked together at the same lab that I had visited long ago in San Antonio. So both of them were inspiring, and I could see some of myself reflected in them. I mean, scientists tend to be introverted, not very emotional, and so on. And so that's pretty much how I am too. So I saw that, oh, I can see you could be a scientist and do this stuff and get interesting results. Others are people like Roger Nelson at Princeton, who we still collaborate with, and Bob John at Princeton, and Brenda Dunn at Princeton, Ed May and Hal Puthoff at SRI International, Russell Targ. All of the names now would be considered senior people in the field, who are either my contemporaries or older, generally like 10 to 20 years older sometimes. Bob Morris at the University of Edinburgh, Dick Bierman in the Netherlands. So those are the kinds of people that I have in mind. And even beyond that, other people who are not known for having an interest in the psi in particular, who are prominent mainstream people whose names I cannot mention because they don't want to be mentioned, who over the years have been very interested in this topic, and I've met them and they remain very interested in these things. We're talking about senior members of the military and the government, members of the National Academy of Sciences, who are just fascinated with this stuff. And in some cases, even doing experiments and not talking about it. So it's a broad range of people who have given me the sense that, well, from a very mainstream perspective, this is all taboo stuff and don't touch it. I know that there are people who are very successful in science and business and government and politics and everything else, who are just as fascinated by all of this as I am. And they may or may not be directly doing anything about it, but they provide a kind of support. Because, you know, whenever you're working over into a domain where people consider the fringe, I'm self-reflective enough to ask myself every so often, it would be so easy to do conventional research. You get the social support, you get more financial support, you get all kinds of things by going along with the status quo. And so, yeah, you ask yourself, is this really worth it? Well, the answer is, yeah, it is worth it because you're not really that alone. You happen to be like a lightning rod because you're more public about it, but there's an enormous number of people who are very interested in this and do value what you're doing. So that I find that to be valuable.
And there's a follow-up question from Archon Tour, who says, what kind of advice would you give to a young person like yourself today, who wants to go into the field, who seems to be a promising potential researcher? What advice would you give such a person?
It would be to find a conventional topic, get as high an academic degree as you can, gain very high credibility in that conventional topic at a conventional place, doing conventional work, until you establish yourself to the point where you don't have to worry about making a living, and then start doing this on the side, or you can read about it on the side. And eventually, either when you get tenure or you have enough money so you can do things on the side and support yourself, then become more active. And that is not what young people want to hear, because they become excited about this the same as I do. But the advice that I got early on was exactly that. And in retrospect, exactly correct. Because if you do this kind of research, like fresh with a master's degree or fresh with a PhD, it is then extremely difficult, if that job goes away, to go back and get a conventional job. It's not impossible, because nothing's impossible, but it's really difficult. So and not only that, so it's not only get a real job first and get established in it and gain high credibility, that's important. But also then, well, what do you study? Well, you study whatever you're interested in. It could be scholarship, it could be science, it could be anything. But at the same time, learn everything you can about everything. Because one of the joys of working with consciousness studies in general is that it does involve everything. It involves everything about psychology, psychotherapy, about physics, about engineering. It's like every topic you can imagine, biology and all the rest, they're all relevant to understanding the nature of this. You need to understand everything. So if a person is highly interested and creative and open enough to be able to learn something about all of science and scholarship, do that. It's not easy, but often, like for me, I'm driven by being curious about everything. So I know a lot. I know a little bit about a lot of things, and I know a lot about a small carve-out piece of how do you do experiments and analyze them and write. Oh yeah, the other thing, learn how to write. Like, don't skip those courses in grammar, and take courses on how to write an article and creative writing, and spend time learning how to do that, because I'm also an editor of a journal, and I get a lot of submissions from people overseas who are English is not their native language, so I can forgive them, but also from people who English is their native language and they cannot write. And if you can't convey to other people what you're interested in, you're sunk, because science is as much about telling people what you did as it is about doing it. So you can be the most creative person in the world, and if you can't express that in a way that others understand, you won't get anywhere. So don't skip the grammar.
As a matter of fact, Dean, I recall somebody once asked you, because you've written 4 books that have all done very well, and someone said, how do you do it? And you had a wonderful answer as to how you write books that are successful in the marketplace. Maybe, because I'm sure there are writers who are watching now. What advice can you give them about making sure your book is good?
I imagine that I'm describing what I've done to somebody who doesn't know anything about it at all, like to my mom when she was alive, or to somebody who has an interest in the field, but they don't really know about the technical details of it. And so you imagine you're describing it to somebody, and then you write that down, and then you do about 20 drafts. You never stick with the first thing you did. And every time you read it again as a draft, you look at it with fresh eyes. You have to put yourself in the place of someone who has no idea what you're talking about. And if you do that, you start reading and you find your mind wandering, there's a problem right there. The moment you detect that your mind began to wander, because you've already looked at this 19 times, there's a problem there. You need to go back and figure out, well, why did my mind start wandering in this passage? And more often than not, it's either not written very well, or it's too abstract, or something is wrong with it, and you need to fix it. So I will go back and look at books that I've written and articles and stuff, and I still find that there are parts where you start going through and then you start dreaming about cheeseburgers. And sure enough, if you go back and you read those passages, it requires just like a little bit too much of a technical description, or something is not quite right with it, which is why many, many repetitions are necessary in order to start weeding them out. And then you ask others to read it after you've gone through this exercise yourself, and ask them to be harsh. Like, could you get through the first 10 pages without falling asleep? If the answer is no, you have to go back and write 30 drafts. So it's not magic that's flowing out of your head in one piece. It takes a lot of work to refine it so that it sounds natural, but it also conveys the information that you want it to convey. And by the way, the same goes for presentations. So I've given enough presentations now to know that you're always trying to attract attention. It's all about pulling attention. So if you see a slide that has more than like 3 bullet points, and they're not presented one after the other, like, so, get a whole page for the bullet points, everyone goes to sleep instantly. It's like a switch. If you have the worst insomnia in the world and you put up a slide that has 45 bullet points, you will cure insomnia right then and there. So if you want it, you have to keep pulling people's attention, because we always want to wander our attention. And you can do that in a slide by pulling the person's attention along. And you have to use pictures too. It doesn't, and occasional cartoons helps as well.
Padraig O'Meara says, hello from Ireland.
Ooh.
What would Dr. Radin like to see happening or think might happen in the research arena over the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, so one of the things that I've been working on myself and through colleagues, and even in a broader sense now, is to break the taboo that prevents these topics from being part of the academic world. Because when you look at the number of people who are actively engaged, either in experiments or in scholarship or history, it's, at any given time, it's about 100. Most are academics, some are not. And 100 people is too small to make a dent in anything. And this is independent of the amount of money that's available. There's very little funding. So this should be part of every academic curriculum in the world. And it's very clear that whenever there's a university where somebody gets permission to teach a special class on this topic, students love it. They're interested in this as much as anybody. And so it always attracts students. So this should be a topic which can be used to teach critical thinking, to teach statistics, to teach experimental design, and so on. All of those, it's a perfect topic to teach because people are interested in the phenomena. And then you could have advanced courses where you learn more about the history and methods and so on. But the reason why it doesn't happen, I calculated once that 1,000th of 1% of the institutions of higher learning around the world have at least one faculty member who's interested and publicly known for being interested in this topic. 1,000th of 1%. That is crazy, because when you do the same exercise and you look at how much of these topics are you seeing in entertainment, in movies and television shows, it's like 25% of everything on the television has something to do with these shows or these topics. So what's wrong with this picture? Very high public interest and awareness and almost no academic interest at all. Well, that's a taboo. And the taboo is largely driven by the assumptions within the academic world usually about materialism and about they're thinking in classical physics terms. But even beyond that, there are all kinds of reasons why taboos begin. And so that one of the approaches that I'm taking, and my colleagues too, to publish as many articles as you can in as many different kinds of journals that you can. So this interview that we're having now is roughly around 600 for me. And that's the other way that I do. I try to do this outreach because I know based on the feedback that when I write a popular book or I give these kinds of talks, I'm reaching a fair number of academics who are fascinated by this topic and will never admit it to anybody, but they can see it anonymously this way. So I'm talking to all you people out there who are professors who would find this a very interesting thing, not only to just be personally interested in, but you'd find that students are interested too. So we break a taboo by talking about it incessantly or writing articles about it and exposing it as broadly as you can to show that there's nothing to fear here other than fear itself, borrowing from FDR. And one of the things about breaking a taboo is this is what sociologists study. So we have a taboo against same-sex marriage, or a taboo about legalized marijuana, and all kinds of other taboos that are in society. When you look at the ways that the taboos are broken, it takes many, many decades to work on it, to keep pushing on these kinds of taboos. And you get celebrities to help you, and there are lots of other ways of making these things change. Well, the approach that I've taken, because we don't have an army doing this, we have individuals who are pushing on it, is to make it interesting, to write popular books that have enough technical information in it so it would appeal to academics. That's why I have hundreds of references in the books. And to keep doing that, to show that, yeah, you can study these things and there's something interesting going on and it's relevant to the way we think about ourselves and possible applications and all of that. So that's what I would do. If I had an infinite amount of money in 20 years, what I would do with that money is do what was done in the UK at Edinburgh to establish a chair, an endowed chair focused on parapsychology. That's now the Kursler Chair, it's said, in the Department of Psychology at the University of Edinburgh. That one chair, which was established around 1985 or so, plus or minus a year or two, That one chair eventually made the UK the world center for this kind of research, because roughly 75 people got their PhDs through that program. And now they're already on the second and third generations of doctorates. So that's one example. What would happen if we had a dozen or 24 endowed chairs around the world at major universities, where the focus of it was the study of these kinds of things? So it's like, we can say as the general term, non-local aspects of consciousness. Well, that was really difficult to do in '85. A lot of universities didn't want to do it, even if the money was available. Today, it's much more easy because the idea of consciousness studies is almost mainstream, or maybe it is mainstream. So this is an aspect of consciousness studies. It would not be that difficult to create. You need like $5 to $10 million to create a big endowed program. If I had $100 million or $200 million, that's what I would do, because it would change the landscape overnight. Because the moment that you have endowed chairs, it's going to come with research money, graduate students, people can get funded, they can see a career developing. That's how you would change this. But so if somebody's watching who has a spare $250 million, call me and we'll chat.
Well, you've sort of articulated one of the reasons why I'm putting up new videos almost every day now.
Yeah, it's all about that. You reach people, right? And you don't really know who's watching on the other side. You don't, I mean, it sounds like $5 to $10 million sounds like a huge amount of money, but for some people it's like nothing. So if they get excited about this and say, oh, an endowed chair in my name, not me, but them, at this such and such university, which is their alma mater, for the study of these kinds of things, which is a very broad range. It could be the study of survival of consciousness, right? I mean, take something like my favorite today is terminal lucidity. So this is this phenomenon where somebody's been in a coma for a long time, or they have advanced Alzheimer's, and they suddenly snap out of it, and they're fully awake, and they have all their memory, and they chat with people, and they reminisce, and then they die. Well, it's terminal because they die soon, but the lucidity part of it doesn't make any sense at all from a mainstream neuroscience perspective, because the brain is not operating anymore. So what is it in them that can become lucid? Well, we have no idea, but it seems to be related in some way to many of the issues that we face in parapsychology, where the brain and the mind are coupled, but do not appear to be the same thing. So there's all kinds of interesting questions that spin out of that. Well, wouldn't that be interesting to study? I think so.
Yeah, I had that experience with my own mother before she passed. It can be very profound. Yeah. Here's a question from Kasaba Hoffman, and I might just mention we've got 8 more minutes. She asks, or he asks, are there studies on collective focus of concentration? In other words, does mass consciousness have a different effect than a single individual?
Very few studies looking at the effects of groups with one, especially for groups that are using the same intention. So the metaphor I like here is that intention is like a little bit like creating a bubble. It's a fragile structure. It's a real thing. It does things. It has a shape, kind of metaphorically. So if you have 2 people trying to create a bubble, they can do it, but in order to do it, they have to be exactly on the same wavelength. You need like a very coherent agreement among people so that they're all doing exactly the same thing. And if you get 2 people and 10 people and 100 people, you can't get them to agree on anything. So sometimes in a large group of meditators who've been doing it for 20 years, they can kind of get into that space. And then you can feel it. There's a different feeling that happens when you're in a group that's been doing this for a long time, and they kind of know how to get into the same wavelength because you're pulled into it. But it takes a lot of effort, a lot of time to be able to create that. So far, there are no studies that I'm aware of that have used moderate-sized groups with this kind of long-term coherence. And the only proviso here are groups of meditators where there's no intentional effect, but there's attention. So these are the so-called field consciousness experiments, where if you put a random number generator or a bunch of them in the vicinity of people doing some mental coherence in terms of attention, then you see changes. You see negentropic effects appearing in the random generators, which is suggestive of something like a field effect, like a coherent field effect that is somehow related to the activity of the group. But if you then ask them to do an intention and affect something, it's very, very difficult to sustain that.
Okay, and a question from Saeed Elgarb, who asks, why do you think psychic people are hard to deal with?
That's a funny question. It's also a true question. Well, one can say that a person who's highly psychic is almost by definition highly sensitive. They're going to be sensitive to their own emotions, to other people's emotions, the things happening elsewhere. And if they have, especially the really good psychics that I know, have very thin filters. Like the reason why they're really good in picking up things is because they don't immediately try to analyze, they don't filter what's coming in. So they can appear to be blunt. And, if you go to a psychic who's telling you what they really are getting and they're not filtering it, it's sometimes not so pleasant because they're in your head, and they're just saying what, as opposed to somebody when you're talking in a give and take in a conversation, there's all kinds of filtering going on. You have to be careful when you're talking to somebody about what you say. Otherwise, they'll appear to be blunt and rude. So it's the combination, I think, of sensitivity, this bluntness that can happen as a result of lack of filters, possibly something about ego as well, that a person who knows that they have special abilities sometimes can be very humble about it and quiet. Not always. They can let you know that they know what's going on in a way that is uncomfortable. I would say that the single thing, though, would be sensitivity. And anytime you deal with somebody who is super sensitive, it's just more difficult because they can complain about ordinary senses. Like this person has perfume and is driving me crazy. And other people saying, really? There's perfume? Well, it turns out it's not perfume. It's like something they rubbed up against and didn't even realize it. Those kinds of super sensitivities can be annoying when it's brought to other people's attention.
Here's a question from Louis Reyes, who asks, what is the status of psi research in Latin America?
I would say as of now, and increasingly so, Brazil is becoming one of the world centers. So I know a number of people who are in Brazil who are doing this kind of research. It's very interesting because the culture is quite different than it is in the US and in Europe in general. It's much more open to these kinds of phenomena, and the science that's being applied takes advantage of that in a good way. It's just a lot easier to find people who are interested in the phenomena and maybe actually have some talent as too, because it's supported by the culture. By comparison, in India, there are lots of very technically adept people, but there the culture is so supportive that it's almost not even seen as a topic that's worth studying. So there isn't that much psi research going on in India because people say, well, why do I need to study this? It's like studying air. Whereas Brazil is a little bit like in between the US, which tends to be quite skeptical about these things, and doesn't have a culture, at least openly, that supports these things. So I would say that the research that does take place in the West tends to be much more rigorous because it has to be. Whereas in Brazil, it's still rigorous, but it's more open, I would say, to a wider variety of ways that the phenomena can manifest. So culture does play a role. And I think that in the future, a combination of the cultural openness and available funding will make Brazil one of the world centers for this kind of research. Now, that's probably true in other countries in South America, but I'm most familiar with Brazil.
One final question. design ideas, and I think probably many viewers are curious about the poster behind you that says PsyQ. What is that about?
Yeah, so that was an iPhone app that we created some years ago, which is based on the idea of IQ, except it would be PsyQ, a way of measuring different psychic abilities on the app itself. So that's no longer available. After a while, it morphed into a version that was called Psi3, the number 3. And we collected a lot of data on that and 3 different kinds of tasks in each case. And we're in the process now of analyzing it. It's mainly Julia Mossbridge, who is the prime mover on all of that. And so that's what the PsyQ is. That's the poster that was associated with the app, because that picture was the first screen that you would see on the phone.
Well, Dean, I want to thank you so much for being with me and being with our viewers. I thought we got some excellent questions and some wonderful answers from you as well. And of course, now this live stream will be archived and will be permanently available for people on the web. And I'd like to remind our viewers they can subscribe to our free weekly newsletter by going to newthinkingaloud.org. That's the New Thinking Aloud Foundation. And in 2 weeks from today, we will have Russell Targ on our live stream, who will be happy to answer your thoughtful questions. So I'll sign off now, and thank you all very much for participating.
Bye-bye.
There, I've ended the live.